For those of you that don't know Aram Hamparian, I just had the pleasure of meeting him and his brother, and they put a wonderful column out in an email, which keeps us all informed about what's going on in Washington and in Armenia. He serves as the executive director of the Armenian National Committee of America. He's the point organization for the administration, Congress, the media, and Washington, D.C. Foreign policy communities. He works in collaboration with Eastern and Western and U.S. regional offices with more than 60 local chapters, dozens of coalition partners, hundreds of community affiliates, and thousands of grassroots activists. So really, it's an outstanding pleasure to have you with us today and share some of your thoughts and share some ideas on how we can better help Armenia.
Thank you so much for Dr. Najarian. Honored to speak with this group. This has been a great education for me. One of the lessons, I guess one of the tougher lessons that the ANC's picked up over the years is to know what we don't know. And certainly we don't know medicine, but we do have the benefit of experts like yourself. Dr. Akimian has been a great resource on issues in Artsakh. Dr. Najarian, Caroline Najarian, who's on the call, she's like an angel and you know, has vast wisdom about the situation in Artsakh and Armenia. Dr. Alina Doryan out in Los Angeles as well. And so we've drawn on that wealth and been very, very fortunate that we have such talented folks in our community, especially in the medical world. We also have Ambassador Nersessian, who's on the call today, and he's obviously a great resource on the situation in Hayastan and about what the government needs and the partnership between the U.S. and Armenia. And we work hand in hand with the embassy, and they do a great job here in Washington carrying the diplomatic torch for the Armenian people. I'll limit myself today, because there's tons of stuff the ANC does, but I'll limit myself today to the COVID crisis. And there's a range of other things that we do: Artsakh, genocide, U.S.-Armenia relations. But on the COVID crisis, we saw in late March that we were getting word that this was going in a bad direction in Armenia. The numbers were still small, but Kim Akimian and others helped us understand that the trends were not good. And while we may not know an awful lot about medicine, we do know something about federal appropriations. And we know that within each federal appropriation, there's some provision that's made. There's some provision that's made for reprogramming of funds in response to unforeseen circumstances, catastrophes. It could be a domestic tornado. It could be a war overseas. But there's always a provision for shifting aid priorities. It can never be done. It's not done by administrations in some unilateral or arbitrary fashion. There are reporting requirements and there are conditions that need to be met, and the Congress gets really the final word at the end of the day. But any administration does have flexibility, though, to move money around when they face new circumstances. And certainly, we would argue that the U.S. aid program to Armenia, which has fluctuated from over $100 million down to maybe $25, $30 million. It's a little bit higher than that now. But we've seen that aid fluctuate. But that aid package, we felt, was a pool of resources, not new resources, not new money that needs to be argued for or lobbied for. It was money that had already been appropriated. So we turned to our government, the U.S. government, and as citizens said, let's prioritize the COVID response over other important priorities. And there's certainly other important priorities. There's other humanitarian programs, democracy programs, governance programs, economic, technical types of things, all very, very important. But we felt that this was just the urgent task of the day. That letter went out, I think, April 3rd. The numbers, I think, were very low. I think there was something like only 640 confirmed cases on the day we sent that letter. And I think, we've seen obviously more than 11,000, or I don't know what the number is now, but some vast increase in the number of cases. We put that request in early April, followed up with our colleagues and friends at the State Department. and heard back from them a couple of weeks later saying, yes, okay, thank you for your note. We will, at the U.S. Embassy Yerevan, take a close look at adjusting existing funding to respond to COVID. They kind of had a little bit of a sidebar there where they said, with a focus on helping Armenia recover, which didn't exactly speak to our request, but nonetheless, it's still within the world of COVID. You know, some resources need to help Armenia recover, and that's a need as well. Since that time, there have been two additional milestones. There was a May 22nd announcement, by the U.S. Embassy that they had reprogrammed or adjusted. I forget the exact verb they used, but they were going to target 1.2 million in previously allocated assistance, that's their words, to the COVID crisis. And then a little bit later, in early June, I think June 4th, they announced that the total U.S. aid for COVID, new aid for COVID, was around 5.4 million. That's new. That's not a reprogramming of existing aid, but that's been like, it's kind of arrived in a couple of iterations as part of the broader international packages. As is often the case, Armenia gets not that much money, but gets more money proportionally, or more precisely, more money per capita than other countries, including Armenia's neighbors. And that's kind of where we've ended up as Armenians. Not huge amounts of money, but certainly more per capita than the neighbors. So that was our request. Our side of the equation is the U.S. side, right? That's where we can act. We're stakeholders and have our rights under our Constitution here in America. So this is what we do. Our goal is to make the introduction. We can't always make the marriage. That's an issue for the two governments to work out. That's what sovereign states do, is they negotiate aid packages and they try to develop, try to balance all the factors and all the equities in that relationship and to come out with the best outcomes. And it has resulted in increased aid for COVID. Could it be more? Yeah, very likely. Does the U.S. have the vast majority of leverage in an aid discussion? Yes, they do. So it's not quite a discussion between equals, but there's probably some room for additional, for more of the existing aid package to be dedicated to the COVID crisis. Whatever else is on the list, whatever's number 2 or number 3 on the list, they'll still be on the list next year or the year after that. If there's a governance issue or reform issue, believe me, they will wait, because they have waited a long time. But this crisis needs to be addressed with, I think, everything that we can bring to bear. So if there's going to be $45, $50, $60 million in this fiscal year moving from the U.S. to Armenia, we like to see as large an amount of that, as large a percentage of that dedicated to fighting COVID. I'm certain, and I base this on Dr. Akimian's advice and that of others, that the needs exist, that that money could be well spent, and it could be well spent by very capable people in the Armenian Health Ministry, very capable people at American University, AUA, that there is a need and there is funding. So that's kind of our engagement on this issue. It's not very technical. We're not involved in how Armenia might spend that money. We're not going to nitpick, exactly which, should this be ventilators, should it be tests, should it be public education? These are judgments for people better informed than we are. But we would our job, because we tend to fight on the appropriation side, is to get as big a pie as possible into Armenia for the purpose of fighting COVID. And then the bright minds in Armenia and the diaspora can put those resources to work. That, I think, is as kind of a tight a presentation of that as I can offer, but I would be absolutely pleased to answer any questions on this subject, to invite Ambassador Nersessian, who's been engaged with us, step by step from day one, doing a great job in Washington. But there's also other issues. I mean, you may have seen the UN elected a new General Assembly president. There's tons of other stuff to go over, but I don't want to get out, step too far out of my lane.
Do we have any questions for Aram?
Is there a role to play for the diaspora in reaching out to any of our legislative representatives, or is this now at a State Department to Foreign Ministry in Armenia, Ministry of Health in Armenia level, and this is not one of the issues that where there's much additional value in contacting our representatives?
No, there definitely is. And what I've learned is that at the moment when somebody from the administration on any issue tells you that they've heard you, they've taken your issues on board, no need to apply additional pressure, we'll take care of it. That is exactly the moment to apply additional pressure, because what they're trying to do is basically get you off their back with a very light commitment. And no, that's exactly when it's good to step up. And thankfully, members of Congress, Congresswoman Spear spoke publicly in support of reprogramming. Others have spoken privately about that subject. And I think it just makes perfect sense. I mean, there's, I don't think an intelligent argument can be made that there's some more urgent priority in Armenia than flattening this curve. And maybe that'll change in a week. Maybe it'll change in a month. I don't know. Again, you folks are the experts. But I think that we've gotten a very fair hearing on the point that this is the most urgent priority. Let's deal with this now. If you have 5 kids and one of them's got 104 fever, that's your urgent priority. You deal with that. You don't love the other kids less. You'll get to them in time, but you got to get that fever down. This is where Armenia is. So yeah, weighing in with legislators is always important. Also, just I would say that's the number one thing. Legislators, almost everything that's ever happened in a positive direction on Armenian American issues has happened because of Congress. That maybe since Woodrow Wilson. Yeah.
Aram, this is John Bilazikian. Thank you for all that you do, and we appreciate ANCA and all. Really do. You made a huge impact on how the diaspora has been able to support Armenia and to stay connected to the U.S. government. So we really appreciate this. I have a couple of things to ask you to clarify. As I understand it, 1.2 million is money repurposed, and 5 million is additional money for Armenia. Is that correct?
Yes, I'll give you the sources I have on that. Very often the U.S. Embassy announces things through Radio Free Europe, which is like a friendly news source. So it was on June 4th that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, announced that there had been $5.4 million in new assistance to deal with COVID. That's June 4th. There may have been news since then, but I haven't seen it. So my thought is that 5.4 is an aggregate number. That's my understanding. I could be wrong. Because very often when politicians talk, or when political people or policy people talk about money, they double count. If you, like when they announce a new bridge in a district, for example, like 8 different politicians will take credit for the same $1 million grant, let's say. So that was a June 4th Radio Free Europe public article. And then May 22nd, the U.S. Embassy said that an additional 1.2 million in previously allocated assistance had been redirected for COVID. And I think that particular announcement was their way of being responsive to the calls for reprogramming. I'm not sure it would have happened without it. Maybe it would have. I mean, the test of this is, again, like, just to be clear, we didn't just make up the idea of reprogramming. It's a very well-established idea. And there was also a precedent for reprogramming, and that's the European Union. The European Union, I believe, announced very early on a $33 million reprogramming. Their message very early was, yeah, we got a lot of important things to do in Armenia, none of them more important than COVID, and they moved the money right over to COVID. So that the Europeans have less of a geopolitical stake in the Caucasus than the Europeans, but nonetheless,
Yeah, good. Yeah, the other question I had, and you might not be able to answer this, but I'd be curious. Obviously, there's a huge healthcare crisis, and funds to improve the wherewithal to take care of the patients in Armenia, that is a huge priority. The other part of this discussion, and we were talking about this earlier, and that is, I use the crass word, to take advantage of this tragedy to help to establish Armenia as many of us are trying to do, as a center of excellence with regard to research. This is a gold mine of opportunity for us to learn about the disease as it is presenting in Armenia. And as we talked about before, it feeds into the care of these individuals as well. Do you know if any of these new monies or reallocated monies, is any of this money going to the epidemiology or learning more about how the disease is presenting in Armenia?
I honestly, I don't know, but I'm going to guess. I'm going to guess that it will, its nature will be more immediate and like to flatten the immediate, to flatten the curve now, not plan for later. Those types of investments are much less common in terms of U.S. aid. You see that in some cases, like there's a lot of that in Israel, for example, but we haven't seen that in Armenia. The U.S. helped set up a lab for a veterinary lab in Armenia some years ago to prevent the spread of diseases among livestock, I think. And there's been a couple other things that the U.S. has done there, but I think the COVID aid would be shorter term aid. That's my guess. But there have been proposals like this. There's Aram Hamparian, who's at Harvard, has talked to us about, how can the U.S. invest in kind of the long-term development of healthcare and on the scientific side in Armenia. This is not, I guess, the topic of this discussion, but the mood toward Armenia, at least from the White House, as much as sort of instinctively or intuitively we would think that it would be much more positive given the recent developments in Armenia over the last couple of years, for reasons that really have nothing to do with democracy, the relationship is much more complicated than just a warm embrace of a very democratic and peace-oriented nation. There's all sorts of regional politics, and with Russia, with Iran, Syria, things of that sort. So the administration's mood in terms of being generous to Armenia, they're not being super generous with Armenia. The aid we're getting has to kind of be fought for through Congress. Like, for example, if Congresswoman Spear had not fought for the Spear Amendment, I'm not sure that we would even have the resources we have right now. So it's a struggle. It's like the administration has not been as generous as it should be given all that Armenia has accomplished in the last few years.
Thank you.
John, I can add just a little bit to that, that there are restrictions on how the money can be spent. The administration has put restrictions on the money cannot be spent, I don't believe, for the purchase of PPE. Just because, right, Adam, just because of the supply chain issues with that. And I don't believe that they want monies going to purchase items from China, which is where the majority of the supply availability is. So I do think that there's some restrictions, but I'm not, my point wasn't about those restrictions. My point was that I believe very strongly that good proposals could be written now and submitted that have a focus on health system strengthening that has longer term impact beyond COVID-19. And I believe that the Ministry of Health, and all of you on this call know that I feel very strongly that the Ministry of Health is led by a team that is very evidence-based focused. And I believe that they might support that.
Ambassador Necessian, it looks like you want to say something.
Please.
Yeah, yes. And thank you very, very much, first of all, to my friend Aram Hamparian for excellent presentation of the very useful job he and his great team are doing here in Washington on pursuing the agenda of Armenian American community, Armenian agenda here in Washington. Great job, and including on the recent one on the COVID related assistance. We work, of course, with Aram on a broad range of issues at the Capitol Hill, with administration, with U.S. government institutions. But of course, this one on COVID-related was yet another demonstration that rapid reaction that ANCA immediately started to work on this matter. As Aram said, it's about $5.4 million assistance, part of it reprogrammed, part of newly allocated money. There was, through several tranches of U.S. government assistance through USAID was allocated to Armenia. Of course, we do not have in Armenia control over this, how it's spent. However, of course, we express consistently our priorities. I do it here constantly in Washington, talk to USAID, the State Department. The recent example was that I passed Larry knows the list of the equipment we need in Armenia. So that very list that I passed to you, I passed also to the State Department, to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and asked him to possibly include, because this is what the Health Ministry needs in Armenia. And he promised that he will channel it through appropriate channels. And very recently, Ambassador Tracy of the United States has met Minister Arsen Torosyan. So they discussed the range of issues Armenia is in need now, and Minister Torosyan explained to Ambassador Tracy what are the priorities for the Ministry of Health. The other area is that this money has been spent through the biolaboratories. The U.S. government, through another package of assistance, has helped the Armenian government to open and run the biolaboratories. So this latest money that has been allocated, the latest fund, partly have been channeled to increase the capacity of these laboratories. And these days, these laboratories are working effectively in Armenia. I can't say a lot of details. Perhaps the Ministry of Health would know much more details about this, but these laboratories are doing a great job. I even mentioned to Pentagon, because Pentagon has also some part in this issue. And recently we talked with Pentagon about allocating also military to military assistance related to COVID. So at this stage, of course, we continue. Aram, from his perspective, me as embassy, working with the institutions I just enlisted, to try to see if there is another possibilities to receive more assistance for Armenia, and to how we can better organize the U.S. government assistance in Armenia. As I said, the Minister of Health met Ambassador Tracy, and also Minister of Territorial Administration Suren Papikyan met for COVID-related assistance issues. So we constantly talk to both U.S. Embassy and American government institutions. But what Aram said, presented, I think it's been very, very useful for Armenia, and this latest phase of assistance is extremely useful, and we need to work in this direction together. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for everything that you do as well. It's so reassuring to know both of you are working hard for us day and night. There's multiple needs on the public health, in the educational area, in the medical treatment area, in the testing area. Has anyone developed a budget of what is needed financially to help Armenia through this crisis?
So you're asking me, Larry?
Anyone.
Perhaps Aram can, or somebody else.
Sure. Well, we try to stay within our competencies, so that's well beyond our competency. But I do know that there are efforts at the ministry to kind of explain. There are discussions within the health ministry. I understand. I don't know personally, but this is what I understand. There are efforts within that Ministry of Health to kind of say, this is our plan and this is the support that we need for this plan. I think also that the UN office in Yerevan is also making an effort in this direction. I'm not sure how far that's come along, but I think that like the best place to start would be what the ambassador said, which is here's a list of the stuff that we need. And I'm going to go back to a comment Kim made, and apparently they gave some assistance to some group that turned out to be a fringe group, and they ended up distributing some misinformation. Stuff like that happens, believe it or not, more than you might think. And I mean, this is, I'm going to be a little cynical on this front, but very often the aid programs to Armenia try to engineer some process or some. There's a bit of social engineering involved in the U.S. aid programs, when very often just Armenia needs resources. Like Armenia is, as Kim said, a resource poor country. They need resources. They need budget. They need equipment. They need some technical advice. But that's the direction we try to push the aid. So it would be very helpful if there was like it would be very helpful if the U.S. government just took the list of what Armenia needs. They can vet that list. It's American taxpayer dollars, right? I'm sure it's a reasonable list, a very intelligently generated list, and be helpful to the extent that you can be helpful to Armenia based on Armenia's terms and less on what some USAID officials here in DC think is good for Armenia. And I won't get too much into it, but there's been a lot of money wasted in that direction, and it's very often will just be better spent. If they need tests, I don't know, maybe the tests are not eligible, but they need tests, help with tests. If they need ventilators, get them ventilators. If they need, yeah. So,
but that's not what's going to happen. Yeah,
this is arm wrestling we have all the time with the administration. But that's for another day. But yeah, I would agree with the ambassador's comment that, or endorse what he's done, which is to share a list of things that are needed. And instead of us trying to be experts on that stuff, we would say we're fortunate, blessed that folks like you and others are able to pull lists like this together. The ministry is able to pull lists like this together, and let's go fight for that list instead of second guessing it or trying to figure some kind of indirect third-party way we can change how Armenians think about something. Just help the Armenians. That's how we would do it.
Any other questions?
If the audience will indulge me, I'd like to ask Aram just some other initiatives. I know I've seen a lot of the ANCA's emails and posts about issues dealing with Azerbaijan. Is there a vulnerability in the time of COVID-19 that Azerbaijan will take advantage of the situation? And again, what can we as US citizens and constituents do? What can we be telling our legislature, so if we're going to, as an organization or as a coalition here, if we're going to contact all of our representatives, we obviously will ask for reprogramming for COVID. That's something we feel very articulate on. Can you also help us develop the messaging for what's going on with Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Well, when the UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire when the virus was taking off, when COVID was taking off, Armenia endorsed that idea. Artsakh endorsed that idea. Azerbaijan remained silent, which kind of signals, that was a signal they sent to the Armenian side. They held major war games for 4 days between May 18th and May 22nd. And since the pandemic started, there have been several cross-border attacks coming from Baku, which these would all lead us to believe that they may view this as an opportunity for some kind of aggression, or they may simply view this as no excuse to stop their aggression. I think that may be more accurate. There are all sorts of alerts. You can go to anca.org/alert, and it's a pre-written letter that simply says, members of Congress, please keep an eye on Azerbaijan. There are signs that they're going to escalate this conflict during this difficult period. By the way, if they do that and it leads to a war, that could have consequences regionally, even globally, on supply chains and things of that sort. So we framed it in more ecumenical, more universal terms. But that would be our number one thing right now, is to keep an eye on Azerbaijan. Separate from that, there are some appropriations and allocations to Azerbaijan's military that we're trying to cut. Other stuff that we're doing for Artsakh, they're making a very, very concerted effort to cut the aid to Artsakh, which is so minor, just a few $1 million a year, almost. By the way, Kim was involved in the very early iterations of the aid to Artsakh and maternal health care in Artsakh. This is a long time ago.
Yeah, this is.
And then they've done clean drinking water, and now they're doing demining. We hope one day that they'll help with rehabilitation. There's a lot of people who've been hurt by mines and others who need the help. But yeah, Artsakh is like front and center, keeping a special eye on whether or not this, I mean, it would not be the first time in Armenian history that somebody has taken advantage of a global catastrophe to hurt us. So we'd be foolish not to keep an eye on it.
If I may, Larry, on this question by Kim, of course, as Aram said, we're alert on this, and that's the recent provocative stance Azerbaijan continues. It has been demonstrated by large-scale military drills that Azerbaijan just organized some time ago, and several attempts both in the line of contact and also in the direction of Nakhichevan of provocations.
Oh, that's right.
But also the statements that have been thrown all the way from Baku on the level of the Minister of Defense and by Aliyev himself, saying that the pandemic is not an excuse sort of for Armenians to avoid the resolution, and also that the only way Armenians understand is the force coming all the way from Baku. So as Aram noted, of course, the fact that Azerbaijan didn't join the call, the very prudent call by the Secretary General of the United Nations, it also indicates that Azerbaijan might any time try to utilize and try to, conduct any provocative activities. I don't think at any time soon they're gonna, do this, because they themselves now are stuck in a number of serious issues, beginning from the oil crisis and the decrease of oil prices globally that brought, we know that Azerbaijan is a country which is heavily dependent on oil income. 90% of the economy depends on oil, and the economy is not diversified. And with this Russian-Saudi Arabia crisis, it impacts also Azerbaijan, definitely, the low oil prices. Also domestically, Aliyev has been trying to fire several heads of regional governments for corruption-related cases, which, interestingly, Pashinyan is very popular in Azerbaijan, and Armenian Revolution is popular because Azerbaijani opposition from United States, from Europe, criticizes the government for not taking corruption-related, cases, and for the lack of democracy, for authoritarian regime. So exactly for this, Aliyev is trying to artificially to camouflage the situation by firing artificially several, including, I think recently I read his assistant, whom I happened to meet in the past in my negotiating practice. So it demonstrates that the situation is not so well in Azerbaijan, but that can go both ways. Either he can try, if the situation deepens the crisis in Azerbaijan, he may try to do another set of provocations to deviate the attention from domestic crisis. On the other hand, he's going to watch closely what's happening in Armenia, and if God forbids, if the situation goes, very, to the worse, they may also try to, take the advantage of this situation, because we know that Azeris are masters in this, to try to watch whenever there is a, crisis or a problem. At the time we have seen, even during the earthquake in Spitak, that Azeris have been celebrating in their streets you know, that the fact of the Spitak earthquake killed so many people. So there are challenges, of course, and we continue our work with Aram. And as Aram mentioned, the issue of Artsakh aid is very important. And I think in your activities, our community, of course, ANCA, Armenian Assembly, they do their alerts to the community. But it's very important, and you know, to continue to ensure the continuity of U.S. assistance. It's only $1.5 million, and it's been allocated for demining purposes, humanitarian demining purposes. Unfortunately, this aid has been cut, and we're working very, very hard with Aram and others, Armenian American organizations, to try to make sure that the Congress adopts a language on this. That's very important. Yeah, thank you.
A question for the ambassador. Dr. Bilezikian mentioned that this unfortunate crisis has led to a potential for lots of research to go on and maybe facilitate Armenia to become a center of excellence in healthcare. And there's already some shining examples where it is, particularly with the eye care project, the osteoporosis project, the stroke project, and others. Is there a similar effort in the manufacturing sector, given the shortages of masks and other personal protective equipment, and given the availability of manpower, is there an effort to bring some manufacturing capacity to Armenia at this difficult time?
Yes, there are, and I fully agree that this crisis, the COVID crisis, is also an opportunity that we need to try to utilize. Today, I was on another conference call together with FAST, Commissioner for Diaspora Zare Sinanian and Ruben Vartanian, and AGBU representative from Paris. I was in a panel where we discussed these opportunities to turn this challenge into also opportunities for Armenia, to make Armenia, because we're going to deal with this long-term impact of this crisis. This is not going to be over soon, and the economic impact can be devastating. So we need to take very serious measures to develop the post-COVID economy in Armenia, because Armenia was doing a great job, by the way, you know, prior to the crisis. The IMF, I recently talked to some IMF representatives here in Washington who indicated that they had very, very satisfying impressions about Armenian economy, about how the economy was doing. They were expecting prior to pandemic 9% economic growth.
Wow.
But now, of course, this data is no longer there after the virus. These things, you know, we need to rapidly, you know, organize ourselves in trying to develop new types of economic activities in Armenia that can take Armenia's role in the global and regional division of labor. As regards to the manufacturing, I think there has been recent attempts of putting together a line of production of masks and several other, you know, I think the Ministry of High Technologies under Minister Hagop Arshakian is working to bring certain technologies and productions in Armenia so that we can, you know, produce. I don't know where did we end up with the production of ventilators. This was one of the possibilities being discussed. But masks are being produced. I think in Tavush Mars, they put together a big line of, you know, production of masks.
That's my understanding as well. And it is, my understanding is that the price of masks for the general lay population is also very affordable. You know, to the point where I've seen you can get 3 masks for, you know, 50 cents, essentially, 200 dirham for 3 masks. And those aren't the N95 masks for the healthcare workers, but certainly for the lay population, it has become affordable to be able to have a mask. So if you're going to mandate that masks be worn, you of course need to also support that they be affordable for the population. So I think there has been a real movement on the masks. I know that there is a lab, a qualified lab, that is looking to develop locally to develop tests for the PCR machines, and they haven't yet had success, but I know there's some support for them as well.
The ventilator project is funny you mentioned. We just got an updated email today. I believe they got an award and a grant. I'll forward that to you later this evening.
Oh, that's great. I haven't talked to Hagop, but that's great news.
Yeah,
let's see how it goes. Yeah.
You know, we ordered masks for our patients. Some of these masks are $6 each, our cost, and we just pass it off to patients so they have something. But if the mask costs so little in Armenia, do they have the capacity to export here, and could that be a revenue generator? But another question I had was thinking of my Jewish friends. Growing up, many of their families were buying bonds to support Israel. Do we in Armenia have anything like that, where Armenia raises funds from the diaspora by selling bonds using an Israeli model?
I think this project has been considered. At the time, I remember the former chairman now of Central Bank of Armenia, Artur Javadian, was talking about it. I can't update you about the current status, but I can double check. I think there was such a project to produce bonds for the diaspora in Armenia, but I don't know what's the latest on that, Larry. I gotta check it.
And one question for Aram, John. That was really, again, great presentation. So many of us care for Armenia, and a lot of people listen, but action is the hardest thing. What percentage of Armenians in America actually respond to the calls and write letters to the congressman and contact congressmen? It seems like a daunting task. Is it always the same people that write letters, or is it a growing number? And what's our message to our colleagues?
Okay, this is a really great question, and one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I'll be philosophical for a second. As Armenians, we talk about, you know, we won or we fought, let's say, the Battle of Sardarabad, or we won the war in Artsakh, and we use we, you know, in like a generous sense, right? Because it was some subset of people who went to Sardarabad or went to Artsakh or who fought in Avarayet or whichever. So that's just the reality of the situation. So it's going to be it doesn't need to be everybody, but it does need to be enough. That's basically what it looks like. And, you know, we don't advertise this a lot, but we do study this, and we have an IT director who's really good on data. And the number of Armenians who take some periodic action, something on social media, something writing letters to legislators, making phone calls, and then there's a ladder of activity up from there to attending meetings and things of that sort. If you were to look at like more than one action would qualify you as an activist, it might be something less than 50,000 in the US, with heavy concentrations in Los Angeles, New York, Boston. So it's a bit of a challenge in that the demographics of our community, like the 1,000th person who calls Congressman Adam Schiff doesn't make much of a difference, but that third person who calls, you know, Congresswoman so-and-so in Utah, like that does make a difference. So there's a lot of stuff here. So it's in the tens of thousands. We see that metric happen all the time in terms of donors, activists, Facebook, Twitter. It's like it's in that universe, and people come and go from that world, but it's in the neighborhood of it's a small fraction of Armenian Americans. Early on in the discussion, I wrote a note here about I wrote the word contrarian because in terms of just the basic rules of social distancing and wearing masks and washing hands, to the extent that Armenians aren't being mindful of these things, it might be the result of you know, kind of a contrarian spirit. It might be a low trust thing. You know, Armenia tends not to be a super high trust society. The idea of authority telling you what to do and people heeding authority because it is best for them is entirely foreign to a whole strain of folks in our community, because authority has so often been hostile or foreign or both. So what I heard the discussion early on about how difficult it is and this, I shouldn't be complaining like this, but when I heard the discussion early on about how hard it is, let's say, to get folks to wear masks or to not attend weddings and things of that sort, I thought, like, yeah, I know what that's like, because we've taken on the task of organizing a group of people that are remarkably high achievers individually, but a challenge when it comes to sort of collective endeavors, which might explain, for example, why in the Olympics, every gold medal we'll learn will be in some individual sport, boxing, judo, weightlifting, rarely in the team sports. And again, I don't mean to come down too hard on this, but there is that contrarian spirit, which has been good in some ways, but in situations like this must be just terrible.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting. We, in New Jersey, we have Congressman Pallone, and, we go to his events and we support him. Yeah. But you mentioned when you're at his level or shifts, 1,000 calls, one more call doesn't make a difference, but to the lonely congressman in the Midwest, it might. Are you recommending that, in addition to supporting our local congressmen, that we try to support these Congress men and women in low density districts to bring them to our cause?
Yeah, actually, this is and I've read as much as I can about ethnic advocacy in America, and I do believe that we always have a lot to learn from the Jewish American community, and I think that they literally in the 70s and 80s understood that local communities on the coast and the Midwest could handle those local legislators, but that the centralized effort, where they have assets that are not dispersed but rather centralized in DC or some other staff-driven enterprise, they devoted those resources to where they didn't have people. So it might be like, I'll use an example. AIPAC would say something like, AIPAC would devote its staff not to talking to Senator Schumer, but to talking to, Senator whatever in the states without large Jewish communities. That's the basic model. It's a very intelligent model, which is let folks who can do what they do, but where it can't be done organically, do it with staff. That's exactly right. And there have been examples of that. Wayne Owens from Utah was a good friend who was supported, I think, centrally. And it's a better strategy, I think, for the Senate than the House. But yes, I agree with you totally, Dr. Najarian. Totally agree.
Larry, I can give you a prime example. When I was a kid, we moved from New Jersey to Indiana. There were 5 Armenian families in Indianapolis, but we got both senators and 3 congressmen in Indiana to support the ANC because my dad reached out to these people and sat down with them and told them who Armenians were. It makes a big difference in a small community for a few voices to be heard. And I'm sure Aram remembers the days when Birch Pie was a big proponent for Armenians.
Oh, but Doctor, every Armenian in Indiana is like an army in and of themselves. And you and I know them. They're like I don't know what the mix of Armenians in Indiana just produces remarkable Armenians. And yeah, really, it's a great community. Great community. Yeah, really.
Well, it's
Fort
easy.
Wayne, Indianapolis. Yeah.
What happened to Mike Pence?
Oh.
I left Indiana.
I think Dick better move back to Indiana.
So Aram, given that, can you just, again, we'd like to just congratulate you. It seems like it was a lifetime ago now, but the recognition of the recognition by both the House and the Senate of the Armenian genocide, given this model that you're talking about. Can you speak to that for the way that, of course, the Senate was anonymous, not anonymous, sorry, was unanimous, it's getting late, and the House was nearly,
okay.
So.
Well, I will say that this is a bit of an exception to that particular strategy in that we did make the heaviest push where we had the most pressure. And there were a few key gatekeepers that had to be won over. And they had to be won over on the House side first, then the Senate side. So that meant Speaker Pelosi. That meant Chairman Engel, who's up for a tough re-election.
Right.
That meant the ranking Republicans in that world, Kevin McCarthy and Chairman McCall. Adam Schiff, Frank Pallone, Nita Lowy. That it was like a centralized effort on like 10 really important people who could get it done. And we knew that once we got the vote, we would win the vote, but we had to get those guys to open the gates. And then the reason and again, this is inside baseball, and Valerjan and I have gone over this in great detail and tried to understand exactly what happened. The real victory was not that the House passed the resolution. We knew the House would pass the resolution. There was no way Nancy Pelosi was not going to bring it up in an election cycle, given her history, given the fact that she couldn't defer to the executive branch as she's done in the past. The relationship did not exist. The real victory was the 405 votes. And I think that's because we never took a vote for granted, ever. And we never gave up on a single vote. In the months prior to the vote, Gregory Meeks of Queens in New York City, he's been against us for 20 years, and he co-sponsored the bill. And we started thinking, things are starting to change, whether it's in Turkey, whatever. And then we the bottom line is we got the 405 votes, and that meant everything. Because winning the genocide resolution on a party line vote, it's just not what the resolution deserved. And getting 405 in the House, just a few outliers, including Pence's brother, which is unfortunate. And then that led to the Senate vote, Menendez, kind of putting it out there that he'll be there every single week. But I think we got it done right. And I think the 405 vote was what it deserved. And that opened the door to the unanimous consent strategy that was adopted in the Senate. I won't explain all the details of that, but it got done the right way, which is very, very gratifying. Very, very gratifying.
Well, you deserve it. It's really a culmination of a lifetime of work and the generation before, and Dr. Babayan's family, and right back to my own grandparents. So it was very, very satisfying. So thank you very, very much for all that you do. And thank you to Larry for inviting him to speak tonight.
Okay. Thank you for your patience and for your forbearance. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's really a
very
pleasure.
much.
And special thanks to your brother, Rafi John, who also suggested you do a great job tonight. Thank you so much.